The world before the creation of heaven and earth was a sea, and an island that embodied the blessing of the goddess who ruled in those lands. That island was called Santnara. In this place, according to the principles, beauty and grace were in the air, permeating everywhere. Every night, like a bright star, sparkled with luxury and hedonism. However, even in such a world, there was at least one cesspool where all the filth was collected. The slums of Kimor. In this slum lived a girl who was forced to pretend to be an unsightly young man in order to work as a shoe shiner. But alas, she was in debt to her employers, and on this night, they cornered her to get even. The men said she couldn't escape this time. She was silent. Then they assumed the guy was mute, and then they grabbed her shirt, and unbuttoning the top buttons, they saw the silhouette of her breasts. So they were convinced she was a girl. They laughed. And then one of them said that although she was ugly on the face, her body was beautiful and she could be taken advantage of. This made the girl angry, and she shoved the rascals away from her and screamed for no one to dare touch her. In her hand was a broken glass bottle, the sharp edges of which she was ready to cut anyone who tried to make a step in her direction. But the man who was her employer was stronger and pushed her in the shoulders, then exclaimed that he pitied an orphan like her, and there was no thanks from her. He felt sorry for her, who could only feed herself by shoe shining, and thought of forgetting what she owed him. But after this prank, he changed his mind. After hitting her in the face, the man told her that he was giving her exactly 1 week to pay him back all the money for his patronage, and if she didn't earn it in time, she would have to deal with men, not shoes, and he would simply sell her to a brothel. A few days later, the girl was hard at work in the Piazza San Celina, as she had been the previous days. 2 gentlemen were sitting on a bench, one of them reading a newspaper, while the unfortunate cleaner polished his shoes. She reflected on the fact that she had only 2 days of the given term left, and that she was still short of the money she needed. She was very afraid of going to the brothel, and decided that if that happened, she'd rather put her hands on herself. But she didn't have time to finish the sentence. On top of her thoughts, a gentleman reading the paper said he'd rather die than apparently have something happen that he didn't want to happen. The girl turned her hearing to their dialogue and began to look through the articles of the newspaper that were visible to her. The man told his friend that death would be far better than taking Lucretia by the hand and entering the ceremonial hall with her. Then he lowered the paper, and the cleaner recognized in him the universally known Cesare Bonaparte. He was the brightest star of the Santnara nobility and the protagonist of countless love scandals. The article said that Cesare had finally met his fate. She was the youngest daughter of the family della Valle, Lucrezia della Valle. The girl attracted close attention of the public, choosing as her husband Cesare, the only heir to Buonaparte, referring to the marriage contract drawn up by the 2 families in the distant past. The entire beau monde congratulated Lucrezia on the fact that her long unrequited love has finally borne fruit. After reading these lines, Cesare crumpled the newspaper in his hand and said that Lucrezia knew how to lie properly. Then he took out a cigarette and said that in principle from a woman such a thing was to be expected. Many of them are very cunning. The shoe shiner looked at the gentleman with surprised eyes, realizing that she was definitely not mistaken, and no doubt in front of her sat Cesare Bonaparte. Who would have thought that she would meet such a high-ranking gentleman in the Piazza San Celina? Accepting this as a sign of fate, she began to think quickly about what she should do in this situation. Maybe she could tell him about her situation, pity him, and he would give her a few gold coins, which were just pennies to him. But will she be able to say a word? Maybe he won't listen to her. Such a beggar. Meanwhile, Cesare told his companion that it looked like he was going to have to follow the same plan. The other man began to resent that the plan was nonsense, and that it was not serious to believe in it. Then Cesare asked him if he had a better idea, and the man replied that they could find the girl and sell her to the Della Valle family. Just from that short phrase, the shoe shiner realized that this was her chance to change her life. It was as if the goddess herself had sent them to her. She jumped into the conversation, and placing her hand on her chest, offered to sell her. She promised to become the most expensive lady in Santnara. The other man asked what was she even talking about, and Cesare asked if the shoe shiners had forgotten how to tell the class of people by their shoes, if she dared to approach them. Then he added that she was mistaken, and he was not in the business of selling women. The cleaner replied that she was correct, and called him Mr. Cesare. She then introduced herself by the name Adele Vivi and said that she meant that she would be better than the others, and could play the role he needed. The man asked how she had such confidence in understanding his goals. Adele replied that she realized he needed a fake daughter of the Bonaparte family that he could send to the Della Valle family instead of himself, thus not breaking the old pact between the families. Cesare was a little surprised and asked the girl how she knew about it. She replied that she had drawn that conclusion from reading the articles in the newspaper. In the marriage contract publicized by Della Valle, only the family name was mentioned and no specific names were mentioned. Therefore, probably, Mr. Cesare intended to get rid of the bonds of political marriage, deceiving everyone, buying a girl and calling her a secret daughter of the Bonaparte family. And a girl was certainly needed, for among the heirs of the Della Valle family, besides Mrs. Lucrezia, her elder brother was unmarried. A young man sitting next to Cesare, whose name was Jude, marveled at Adele's cleverness, who could make such an analysis from scraps of newspaper. Carassa replied that they were just wasting their time. He said that the Della Valle family had been known for centuries to produce great scholars, and they were not the kind of people to give away a shoeshiner who could barely read. Adele asked, what if she didn't just barely know how to read? Cesare froze, realizing that she had asked the question in another language. It was the language of the Dinan. The girl said she also knew the language of Algiers. Jude watched the dialogue between the two people in different languages with interest. Cesare then asked how she was able to learn all these languages. Adele replied that she had read books in the public library and glimpsed the speeches of foreigners. Cesare clutched his head, amazed that someone could learn languages only by occasionally listening to foreigners speaking in the streets, and added with a chuckle that he felt like he was being played by a sea goddess. Adele had already had some hope that she had been able to convince them, but Cesare, calling her by name, said that the point was that his sister had to be not only clever, but also very handsome, like him. After all, she had to look pretty to sell. That was the most important point to please the eldest son of the Della Valle family. He stood up along with Jude and walked past, saying she was not suitable. Adele asked them to stop, threw off the cap under which she hid her long hair, which was a sea wave color, even a deeper emerald, and pulled the false rippled cheeks off her face. Underneath all that makeup was an incredibly beautiful girl. She hid her appearance so that the men from the slums would not pester her and force her into a brothel, where such parameters were highly valued. Adele turned around and asked Cesare if he was ready to disqualify her now. Jude said that when Adele had suggested pretending to be Cesare's sister, he'd thought it was nonsense, but looking closer now, he saw that they did look alike. Their eyes were both yellow in color, and their hair was almost the same shade of sea, only Cesare's was more blue and Adele's green. Wasn't that the perfect match? Cesare skeptically asked the girl if she was not a noblewoman. She replied that she wasn't. Then he asked who her parents were. Adele said there was no point in asking that of an orphan. Cesare pondered for a while and said that in that case he was indeed curious. It's not like Adele was a common fool who didn't realize that if she was exposed, she would be killed immediately. So why did she need to do this? Without emotion on her face, Adele answered that she was just hungry. Cesare turned his back to her and replied that whatever it was, he was sending her away. This was also said in a foreign language. Adele, placing her hand on his chest again, answered him that they would meet again in the same place where they desired each other. Cesare grinned as he heard the continuation of the quote from Dante's play and thought that he had found an extremely useful woman. He then told her to come to the Bonaparte estate until tomorrow noon. In the evening of the same day, Adele, again disguised and hiding her hair under her cap, sat on the floor of the shanty in which she usually slept. She rolled up her belongings, which were probably just a mattress, and hugged her knees, unable to believe that there was a chance to get out of this hell. She couldn't believe that Cesare Bonaparte had actually accepted her offer, and in the days to come she would live like a noblewoman. No longer would she have to worry about being turned into a brothel. The only thing she longed for was her friend with whom they had lived together at the orphanage. A sunny, blonde-haired girl named Clarice. Adele would miss her, and she was sorry they couldn't meet before she left and say goodbye. Clarice was busy, so the girl wrote everything to her in a letter that she was going to send when she went to the mansion. Suddenly, someone started banging on the door. The door swung open and the employer came inside. He said he knew she intended to run away without paying for the patronage. He grabbed her by the elbow and wanted to drag her behind him. The girl broke free and climbed onto the table toward the window. The man demanded that she come to him and ran after her, trying to grab her by the shirt, yelling that she dare not run from him. Cesare's words from the afternoon's question replayed in Adele's mind. If she's declassified, she'll be killed instantly. So what does she need it for? She didn't care if she died if she could escape from here. At least live like a human for a little while without worrying about getting a piece of bread in the filthy slums. For that, she didn't spare her life. She jumped out of the window and ran as fast as she could. In the pouring rain, her makeup slipped off, she lost her cap, and after a while she managed to reach the mansion in a disheveled state, completely soaked with her hair loose, shirt and pants. The butler greeted her and told her they were expecting her. The man's name was Ernst. He opened the gate and said the head of the estate was expecting her. Adele walked into Cesare's study and bashfully lowered her gaze to the floor. Seeing the dirty and drenched girl, the man, pretending to call her his favorite little sister, asked how come she was soaking wet and asked her to share like an older brother. The girl replied that Mr. Nino, her employer who ran a bunch of shoe shiners in Kimura, was harassing her because of overdue patronage fees. She was about to add that he would not stop the harassment, but Cesare interrupted her and said that the old man was already dead. The girl was taken aback by the words she heard. Cesare said that it had been a terrible downpour today, and as he heard, because of such a heavy rain, one of the shacks in Kimura could not withstand and collapsed, and inside was the same Mr. Nino. Death due to an accident in the slums is quite common. Afterward, he asked Adele if there were any other people who were annoying her and able to interfere with them. Obviously, the accident was no such thing at all, and Cesare had been directing surveillance on the girl since their first meeting, after which he had removed one of the obstacles in the form of her patron demanding a debt. Adele understood that, and it seemed to her that the question asked referred to Clarice, but the girl answered that there was no one else in the way. She was afraid for her friend, to whom she wanted to tell everything, but she was afraid of Cesare. It was necessary to keep everything secret and to protect her friend from him. Cesare said she had nothing to worry about as long as the plan didn't go wrong, but it would be better if it didn't. Then he said that now that all the business was taken care of, they should move on to the main thing. The objective was already known. Adele was to seduce Della Valle's son and marry him, and starting from body and mind, manner of speaking, and ending with the tips of her fingers and toes, the girl was obliged to become perfect Buonaparte, so that no one would doubt that she was not his sister. She must become a true noble woman and fool the whole of Fornati society. Afterward, Caesar smoked and said he would give her a period of 3 months to prepare. If in that time she could not become a lady he would recognize, the plan would go to the dustbin. A thought popped into Adele's head. If the plan goes to the dumpster, won't she follow in it? All she said in response was that she understood him. Cesare then asked if she would even ask why he was giving her exactly 3 months. Adele replied that she assumed it was because Mr. Cesare had planned to fit it in with the date of his birthday reception. Cesare replied that it was exactly that, and then got up from the table and walked over to the girl. He said she had a real talent for uncovering his plans from newspaper articles alone, and he felt as if she knew even more about his family than he did. Grabbing Adele by the chin, Cesare said there had to be a reason for that after all. Maybe she was interested in him. Cesare said he understood her feelings completely. And for a slum dweller with only a face, a newfound brother must seem like a mission to which one would want to attach oneself. But he decided to warn Adele that he did not wish to see her in his bedroom in the middle of the night. The girl calmly thanked him for his advice and added that she was not interested in him at all. Adele thought to herself that although he was handsome, he seemed crazy. Cesare laughed and said that the girl's face at that moment was very funny. He then stepped back and explained that he warned for the reason that something like this had happened to him before. Adele, calling the man a gentleman, said she would keep that in mind. Cesare told her that from now on she should not call him sir, but brother even when they were alone together. Adele immediately said she understood, calling him what he asked. Cesare praised his sister and added that from now on her name is Adelaide Buonaparte. She is younger than him by 5 years, and all this time lived in distant Capallo, somewhere across the sea, considering herself a commoner. And suddenly, for some reason, she decided to come here alone. Adele thought that it turns out, explaining the reason why she became Buonaparte, she would have to adjust to the situation. Was that Cesare's intention? She asked her brother if he intended to initiate the chairwoman into the plan. Cesare's grandmother and president of the Signoria. The local parliament, Eva Buonaparte, was incredibly influential. Without her consent, it was impossible to even begin planning such a thing. The man replied that he was sorry, but he couldn't tell her. The dearest Mrs. Eva was so eager to see her grandchildren that she was ready to receive Lucretia with open arms. It turned out that the chairwoman supported their marriage. Caesar asked Adele if she was interested in anything else. It seemed to him that the most important thing had been left out. His parents. Since Adele was going to pretend to be his own sister, wouldn't it be worth finding out about them? Adele herself was surprised and asked again, as if there was no point in her inquiring about it herself. Would there be a single person in Santnara who didn't know? Rumor had it that Caesar's parents, mad with love for each other, had run away, abandoning both their families and their young child. Adele replied that she had only heard that the year Caesar turned 9, they had moved away. Cesare said that in that case, no further explanation would be needed. Then he suggested telling people that his parents had gone insane a second time and had given birth to her, and that would be the end of it for the day. Cesare opened the door of his study and letting his sister out, said that a maid would be waiting for her in the corridor, whom she must follow, and calling her once more Adelaide Buonaparte. Then said that he would like to believe that the next time they met, she would be able to display an image more befitting a lady, and he would look forward to seeing great progress in her changes. Adele promised her brother to do her best. The maid bowed to the girl and said she was honored to serve her, Lady Adelaide. Her name was Aphone Cora, and she was the governess appointed for her. She ushered Adele into a room and told her it was her bedroom. The room shone with brilliance. The sets, the curtains, everything was bright, pearly, and very clean. Aphone had said that the Bonaparte rejected luxury, so the decoration could not be called luxurious, but the girl would still be comfortable here. Although she herself agreed that it was too modest for a lady's quarters. Adele was amazed that such an interior was not luxurious, and by the standards of nobles, on the contrary, quite modest. She had never seen anything more beautiful, and she couldn't even think that she would ever live in such a bedroom. Aphone added that the girl should address her freely, and in no way her equal. And from tomorrow, etiquette classes would begin. So if Madame Adelaide catches cold due to hypothermia, it will be a big problem. She escorted Mistress to the bathroom and said she would help her take it. Adelaide replied that she could wash herself, but Aphone said that aristocrats never wash themselves, exclusively with the help of servants. Adelaide wanted to argue, but the maid said her words were not a request. Reluctantly, the girl took off her pants and shirt. She wasn't at all embarrassed of her body. She didn't want her bruises to be seen. Her entire body was covered in purple stains. Aphone didn't have time to say anything before Adele anxiously exclaimed that the bruises would come off soon. She knew this because she was beaten regularly and old bruises always came off quickly, and afterward she asked the maid if she would report it. The thought crept into her head that Caesar would think her body was ugly and break the contract. Aphone said the contract between Adelaide and Mr. Cesare would end after she married de la Valle's son. Until then, all it will take is not to be exposed by the young lord of their kind. So, with proper care, the bruises would have time to heal. Adele sighed and said, "Thank the goddess." Aphone turned her back to her and added that although the wounds would heal, the girl was too gaunt. So the focus now should be on regaining her health. After all, she was now Lady Buonaparte. With those words, Aphone threw rose petals into the bathtub. After the bath, the maid left her mistress and came to Mr. Cesare's study. He asked the faithful maid what opinion she had of his sister. The woman said that the state of her health left much to be desired. There were also many marks from beatings on her body. Caesar said to this that the chipped pearl was practically worthless. Aphone added that these were injuries that with consistent treatment would completely come off and leave no scars. And when the lady gains some weight, her beauty will outshine many. Cesare said the girl was very beautiful even now. He even felt a little sorry that they were now related. Aphone got annoyed at those words. Cesare smiled and told her that she could not worry, he would not touch Adele. After all, she would die anyway once his problem was resolved. Adele woke up in the middle of the night, out of old habit. When she lived in the orphanage and in the slums, sleep was sensitive to going on the run at any moment if someone got to you to do harm. She walked over to the window that overlooked the sea and noticed that ships were returning to shore with their catch. Usually it was about this time that the fishing boats that had been working all night came into the harbor. Soon, some fishermen would start giving away the fish they couldn't sell to the needy. She herself woke up at dawn every day, staggering around the marina, hoping to make it in time for the distribution. And now her life was luxurious. She still couldn't believe it. With longing and anxiety, Adele asked herself, could she handle everything with dignity? Realizing that it was unlikely that she would be able to sleep yet, the girl picked up a book lying on the table and lay in bed to read. As she leafed through page after page, the girl didn't notice that morning had come and Aphone had entered the room. She noticed that the mistress was already awake. Adele, who could only call herself that in private and turned into Adelaide as the day wore on, said she had just woken up early enough that she couldn't go back to sleep. Putting the book aside, the girl asked what she should do now. Aphone was glad that the mistress was enthusiastic. From today, there would not be a single free hour in her schedule. However, they would start with a meal. Breakfast was rich, the long table was bursting with treats. Aphone pulled back a chair and asked Madame to sit down, then asked if she had any food preferences. Adelaide replied that she didn't really like rotten things, but in general, anything would do. She could even eat insects. Aphone decided to let those words pass her ears, and commented that it was a good thing she wasn't picky like some of the other ladies. It was a good quality for a noble lady. She then began to recount and explain that table etiquette was one of the mandatory skills for nobles. One could call it the foundation of the basics. Starting a meal, one should always use the utmost utensils. It is also necessary to keep the posture and lift the chin up, and the elbows should not touch the table. It is not allowed to keep both hands under the table during a meal. Adelaide nodded and repeated all the instructions. Aphone told the girl she was doing great and offered to taste the food. Setting a piece of meat on her fork, Adele tasted it and glowed as if with true happiness. She had never eaten such delicious food. Her cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkled. Continuing to observe all the rules of etiquette, Adele began to actively try one dish after another. Aphone sounded out each of the dishes. The first was beef carpaccio with arugula and celery, followed by linguine with mackerel and abalone, halibut with potato gratin and tomato sauce. Adele was ready to lick her plate. It was so good, but then she came to her senses and wondered if she had eaten too greedily, like a vagrant. But Aphone reassured her, saying she was glad to see that the lady had a good appetite. For a while, she should eat more than 4 meals a day, as a noble lady must be in body. This news made Adele happy. She would finally be able to eat enough for all the years she had been starving. After breakfast, Aphone gave Mrs. Adelaide a tour of the mansion. She showed the library, reception room, art gallery, billiard room, refectory, and many other rooms. In the central area of the first floor was the young master's office. Aphone had warned the girl that if for any reason she needed to visit the young master, she should definitely enter without knocking. That was the rule of the mansion. Adelaide asked if there was anything else she should watch out for. Aphone thought for a moment and replied that it was better to report it at once. The circle of people who knew about the contract between Adele and Cesare included only 6 people, including Aphone. However, in a few days that number would increase to 7, and that person would be the etiquette teacher, Madame Flavia. She is somewhat strict, but at the same time Madame has the best competence, so one must listen to her very carefully. Adelaide asked the maid how she should greet Madame Flavia the first time she met her. Aphone replied that that was correct. They should now learn the bow adopted at Fornati. Holding the skirt with one hand, one should bend the legs slightly at the knees while keeping the back straight, and bow the head. Adelaide repeated the bow perfectly the first time. Aphone told her mistress that she looked ravishing, and she grasped everything on the fly. When evening came, Adelaide went to bed. Aphone lit a candle and wished mistress for the night that the sea goddess would protect her sleep. The girl wished her the same in return. As the door slammed shut, Adele relaxed and listened to the silence. The silence brought calmness. The shouting and noise that was her eternal companion in Kimura would not reach here. It turns out there is a world where it is so peaceful and good. Eating a hot meal and sleeping in silence is commonplace for some. She felt this happiness and fell soundly asleep. But the dream was disturbing. The waves of the sea were turning into a real storm and crashing down on her, and some inner voice, calling Adele by name, shouted for her to run away as soon as possible. The girl opened her eyes, frightened by the nightmare. At that moment, Aphone burst into the room and shouted to the mistress that they were in trouble. They must hurry. Madame Flavia had unexpectedly arrived at the mansion for a visit. Aphone handed the girl a robe, telling her that they had no time at all to get ready. They should at least put something on first. Sleepy Adelaide didn't realize what was going on. At that moment, Madame Flavia herself entered the room without any knock. A noble old family that had served Buonaparte for generations was Lorendin. But undoubtedly, Flavia Lorendin was the loudest name in social circles. First, she was known for the fact that due to its beauty and elegance resembled a work of art. And secondly, she was known for her stroppy temper and excessive severity in teaching young ladies. Just entering the bedroom, Madame Flavia cried out that it was sheer shamelessness that the girl was still unclothed, although she had appeared early in the morning. Adelaide lowered her head and apologized, explaining that she was in as much of a hurry as she could. Me. Flavia shouted back that no one had allowed the young lady to speak. She resented that she had to teach something to this girl who had no manners at all. Adele thought in her mind that she didn't understand what this woman wanted from her if she herself forbade her to speak. At this moment, Mr. Bonaparte himself appeared at the door. Cesare told Madame Flavia that if etiquette had been known to his sister, she would not have been called. And afterwards, he added that he had not thought Madame would visit them so early. Madame Flavia took off her hat and approached Mr. Cesare, asking him to let her say something. The man replied that he would begin by greeting the dear madam and kiss the woman on the cheek, putting his arm around her shoulders. Afterward, he asked her if she had gotten a good night's sleep last night. The indignant and angry Madame Flavia replied that of course she had, but Cesare interrupted her, saying that it was fortunate and he would be even happier if they joined him for breakfast. Well, except he wasn't sure if Madame would have the time. Madame Flavia replied that of course, since she was invited by her master, she was free for him at any moment. Because of Cesare's position, Madame could not refuse him, and consciously went to his manipulations and let him play his game with a dazzling smile and charm. Cesare said it was wonderful. And Madame Flavia, grasping her forehead, told the gentleman that he was really, Cesare suggested that, handsome, but the woman said very resourceful. Then the young man said that this was the reason why the girls gave him their young hearts. Cesare's gaze turned toward the sister who stood behind Madame Flavia and looked at him with a serious look. He said that he had not realized that she was going to take a bath and should have come in a little later in that case. Mimi. Flavia reproached the gentleman, saying that he ought not to say such a thing so carelessly. What would he do if that one made up all sorts of nonsense after hearing it? Adele looked away with annoyance. She was uncomfortable with being called that ones without even asking her own opinion on the matter. Continuing to smile, Cesare said that the look on Adelaide's face said that she was definitely not going to make up anything, and even hurt his male ego a little with it. Madame Flavia was outraged that the girl dared to raise her eyes and began to shout at her. The woman's eyes squinted. She approached Adele and abruptly pulled away her negligee, exposing a shoulder covered with bruises. Still screaming, me? Flavia asked. What are those ugly marks? Adele replied that it was nothing serious and the bruises would soon fade, leaving no imperfections on her body. It certainly wouldn't interfere with their plan. Cesare watched seriously at what was happening, letting the madam scream. The woman turned around to him and exclaimed that this wretch wouldn't fit. After all, they don't even know where she used to hang around. Not only could she have been beaten by drunken beggars while she was selling her body, but she still had scars. Even among the lower class, she's the bottom. People like her are lazy and have no inner core. If she had 100 years, she wouldn't even come close to looking like an aristocrat. And her intentions of participating in the plan is probably to raise her status by using her body. These words deeply offended Adele. She was trading her body. Was she lazy and selfish? Did she want to deceive everyone? How could this woman judge her so confidently without knowing anything about her past? Images of her past life immediately flashed before her eyes. How the patron, drunk and playing cards, shouted at her that she was foolish and forbade her to look at him so that she would not think him pathetic. How customers would shove her to the ground, yelling that she didn't know how to shine shoes. How people from the shops came and demanded debts from her. Every day, she diligently cleaned dozens, hundreds of shoes, endlessly paid her debts, but she proudly lived this way, without an extra piece of bread, believing it was better than trading her body for easy money and food. Never had she allowed anyone to touch her body. But Adele suppressed the indignation within her. Clutching her hand firmly on her negligee, apologizing to Madame, the girl said she knew she lacked a lot, but she would try harder. Madame Flavia began to shout even louder. How was she going to hide her true origin with such efforts? Does she really think she can deceive the eyes of those born and raised in high society? Where did she get such arrogance from? Living her whole life at the bottom. Every word was a slap in the face. Adele said that she had grown up without parents and had no education, so she couldn't know if it was possible, but her brother thought she could fool everyone by bringing her here. She skillfully managed to turn the situation around so that all the insults now sounded like a rebuke to Cesare's competence and confidence. Adele then added that if Madame thought her brother was mistaken in his judgment, why not discuss it with him personally? Madame Flavia was silent, and Cesare looked at his sister with pleasure and a little pride that the girl did not keep silent, though it was not the best position to take. So, We look forward to your comments about this story. To not miss new videos, please subscribe to notifications. Thanks for watching.